Yeah, so let's suppose the choice, the apparent choice of, do I walk listening to a podcast or do I walk without the podcast? The question there is, what do you really want to do? And it's not an easy question to answer, but what you could feel into is putting the podcast on a way to avoid something. Does it feel like it's helping me avoid something, or is the idea of not putting the podcast a way to force myself to do something that I think is more appropriate or spiritual or whatever? And you can't really. I mean, that's just like me imagining that situation. This is kind of how I would. Um, but just feel into and try to look more deeply at what's going on, and then as you see, the decision will happen which is deepest. The more you see what's happening, the decision will happen that's the deepest. So if you start to see and you see, oh, the podcast is a total avoidance, oh, it's so obvious, I see it, then you will now more likely open this freedom to not put it on. Because you'll be like, oh, it's just an avoidance. I'm curious to see what it is to not avoid. Or you could realize that it's an avoidance and still avoid, but then most likely that's like a little mind trick that's happened where you haven't really seen through the avoidance. But this is kind of getting into the weeds of like a hypothetical decision. The bigger question is, I think, what you're asking about, what are we doing to kind of delay? I think the core of that, one thing is like, it'll take the time that it takes and it'll be perfect, because it's also what's wanted, because we are ultimately free, and the sense of lack of freedom is what we're choosing. And it's not a choice from masochism, it's a choice from love and freedom. Now, what are we doing, if anything, to delay at the level that we can? And I would say there is too much of a sense of challenge. So when I said what you're saying I said, which I can totally imagine saying, it didn't have to take that long. I would have said that because when I went through everything that needed to happen, it wasn't as bad as it seemed from the other side. And so a lot of life is realizing that what we're afraid of and what we're avoiding is mostly a ghost. And that's why, I mean, very, very kind of famously, people of older age who are asked what they regret, it's the things they have not done versus what they did do, generally speaking. Because you start to realize all of the pains and all of the struggles and all the things that I was avoiding, they weren't that bad. I could have lived more, I could have done more, I could have explored more, experimented more. And it has to do, this has to do with that as well, in that it's what we are avoiding because it seems scary, difficult, painful. Ultimately, it's not that bad. And it actually is, that is the liberation, is to see the most difficult thing that I imagined going through, I've gone through, and it wasn't that bad, which is death. And so it's not obviously death of the body, because I don't know that, but it's everything I could have imagined death would be. Because it was the ending of myself. And then going through that, and yes, it was brutal in ways, but then it's like, wow, that I didn't need to avoid that much. It was like ripping off a Band-Aid, like a really big one. And it also, I have to say, it's been a few years, so kind of the painful aspect of it is like more and more forgotten. Because I remember closer to the time I was telling Catherine, like, well, if I had to go through that again, I don't know. But I remember saying, like, that was really fucking brutal.
I was there.
You were there, she was there. It was brutal. But it was just like, ultimately, it was just the core of what I was avoiding was just one night. Why are you laughing?
I don't know. Because it seems like slim consolation, like a night is long. It wasn't even a whole night.
No, it was just a
few hours.
A few hours. Well, basically everything that you thought you were ending, with all the feelings implied, and the whole universe exploding, and you're on the floor crying, weeping, begging to your wife, God.
Yeah, you say that now.
Yeah, you say that now until you get close to it and you're like, fuck no, get me out of here. Yeah, and I don't know what it is to give birth, but
I do.
She doesn't. So she could speak to kind of something about that, but
yeah. Well, may I?
Yes, please.
Yeah, like Nico isn't really one to ask for much help, or to like he's had like a lot of years of like very intense training of like saunas and like a lot of intensity, and a pretty freaking strong and challenging father, and he was on the floor begging for help in terror. Sorry, and yeah. Because Nico had told me many times about experiences that he'd had when he was younger, like, oh, I had this opening and I would end up in the hospital and they'd be sending me home, like, there's nothing wrong with you. And I was like, it's not that I didn't believe him, I believed him, but like, you can't really believe that until you feel it. So that this night that we're talking about, at a certain point, like I had been with him sort of tending to his requests to be with him because he was scared. And then after like several hours, I'm like, okay, I think he's okay. So I'm going to like sneak out to the bathroom. And then when I came back from the bathroom, he was lying on the floor with a picture of his teacher in the air. And I was like, okay, so I don't know what that is, but he's shifted. Like he's kind of self-containing at this point or something. And then I walked toward him, and when I got to, I don't know exactly the distance, like maybe here or something like that, it was just like this, like, it was like walking under a waterfall or something. It was like this extremely palpable, like something just went like completely through me. Like it was just so palpable, so substantial. So anyway, I feel like I was given a really very, very intense and powerful and like life-changing taste of what actually happened to you. So there was something that was shared, which was good, because it's really hard to know from somebody just telling you, oh yeah, this thing happened to me. I'm like, cool. As opposed to going, oh, that, oh my God. But then you were fine. And then we went on like nothing had happened.
Yeah.
For a while.
Yeah, so it was, also, I'm not speaking to the marvel of that and the bliss in what happened, but kind of leading up to it was death, was total absolute going, not just imagining, it was going through everything that could have been known to my body, mind, Nicholas as dying.
It's like shame.
Well, shame was one of the things I went through. It was a deep part of it. But just gonna hide this. But my point is that I had come up to that edge for decades. And all of those times, multiple times, it was this sense of like, I can't, no way, I don't want, there's no way. But I had come to the edge, and I always jumped back. And I know that it couldn't have happened any sooner, but at the same time, all of my energy focused on avoiding that and running from it was unnecessary. And so, in a sense, we're addicted to that avoidance. And it's like saying, hey, like you can get off this addiction, and it's really good on the other side. But you'll go through withdrawal, and it's gonna suck. It's just harder to detect the addiction because it's not a substance. It's thought. It's the addiction to the false sense of self, to the contraction of separation, of imagined separation. Yeah, but the rebel is a great quality. Obviously, everything has two sides, but it's never about going to boredom. Like, what is boredom? What's actually happening? Like, I would never kind of recommend to like do the thing that's boredom, that brings you boredom. But when boredom is experienced, look closely. Notice what's happening more deeply. But I wouldn't direct kind of a practice that's like putting you into a state of boredom kind of habitually. But boredom's an interesting experience. And it has to be seen, it has to be understood and seen through. there's aspects of boredom that are really kind of illusions. For example, I'm bored, but I'm actually afraid. That's just one example. But there could be, obviously, that's why I'm saying it's tricky, because we can get stuck in states of boredom. And so repeating what puts us in that state is really not useful. It's really about piercing through and aliveness. So that's what, like, I'm just going to tie in what Kay had mentioned of vipassana. And it is about moving through that. How can you move through? Because there's what I would call the tamed experiences, that which is very known and familiar, emotional states, mental states, and that's what we get attached to. And so at first the work is to kind of disattach, to move through, to be able to kind of flow. But then we're going to start meeting the deeper level, which is the unknown and I'm using this separation of tamed and untamed from Richard Moss, who's one of my teachers. And when we meet the untamed, it's that like, holy shit, this is there, and I cannot be with it. It's this sudden like, holy shit experience. And it's going to be more of the quality of like a deeper, uncertain fear or pain in some form. And it's untamed because I can't be with it in my normal way of relating. Versus the tamed is like, it sucks, it's boredom, it's all of these emotional states that we don't necessarily like, but they're comfortable in that they're familiar, and they're this kind of cocoon of emotional meh. Versus the untamed is like, I'm going back into boredom as long as I can get away from this. Or I'm going back into all kinds of shitty emotional states that I prefer as long as I can get away from this. And the this that I'm pointing to is that untamed, is what I was talking to Jason about. It's like that where at the core is like, no, not this. I'm just not. There's no way I'm touching this. I think you have, and I think everybody does, but the way to distinguish, and it's more of a spectrum, is this something familiar that I've been here before? And it's kind of
Chronic.
chronic, or it's kind of known, and I really don't like it, or I don't necessarily like it, but it's kind of like, here I am again. That's the tamed. And the untamed is usually there's like a bit of we cross into another level. It's like a leap, and usually there's a kind of barrier. There's like some big fear or pain, like what you described about last week. Maybe that was it. That's why people who take psychedelics produce. That's what it breaks you out of the tamed. And so there's a lot of meditation practices that do that as well. Like doing vipassana for a week is going to break you, because you're going to be sitting with the tamed, moving through, not getting stuck, and that's going to start putting you into a relationship with the untamed. Yeah, the trick with the psychedelics is that a lot of it is like, it's a simulation of experience. And it also, because it's kind of created through a substance, it's like just a training for going there, but in a way you're making tamed the untamed. And what we need to do is to be in the untamed more permanently. To learn to be in the unknown, in the new, in the always being born, always just that's what happens in that breakthrough in disidentification. It could be temporary, partial, or total, where you are no longer pulling and attaching to what is the tamed. And I just gonna add a question that I usually don't read the messages in the middle of it, but I got one from here that's quite relevant. You're saying, do you think sometimes it's bliss we can't bear, so it presents as fear and pain? That's really appropriate. It's very true. It is very often the untamed is ultimately the core of it is love. And when it moves fully, is extremely blissful. But it's unbearable. And this is something I will describe, because the first times I touched that which Catherine was describing, she was with me the first time I was a teenager, and it was just absolute pain. And it was so intense I passed out. And it would happen that I would go unconscious. I actually would enter kind of dream vision states. My mind would just take me into dream. I would be sitting, and then I would wake up. But it was intense pain. And as I discovered spiritual practice and did the practice, and years went by, I would always happen to come up to that again and again and again. And one of the breakthroughs was when I stood with it for long enough that it turned into bliss. And I noticed the moment it went from the most intense, horrible pain I was running away from into bliss was the moment it started to wane. So it was coming up really intense, and the moment it started to go away, like it started to fade, so it wasn't going to completely kill me, which was the experience and the fear. I was feeling I was going to die. The moment it started to fade, and I realized, okay, I'm not going to die now. I'm not going to die today. The fear went away, completely dissipated. And that energetic sensation, which I was feeling and perceiving as pain, it didn't change. It's just that the second the fear was taken out, the same sensation, the same energetic was known as love. And it was a bliss. But it's the same sensation that was pain was seen as bliss. And that's really hard to kind of convey. And then I would come up to it a million times and I would know it as pain. And that is really, really strange. But then in that, when ultimately the resisting of that, which was the belief in separation, the belief in what I am is Nicholas, body mind, when that completely dissolved, the bliss just was free to move through as bliss and no longer as pain. But yeah, it's very much what you're asking about, Katie. And that's something that happens is a lot of we avoid, and a lot of that untamed is vast, expansive freedom, bliss. But the thing is, we can't be there as separate. So if you come to that as a separate self, you will know fear and pain. And as you disidentify as a separate self, you will know that as yourself, and it'll be freedom and love. But it's always this, we want it both ways, to be there as a separate self and know it as love and bliss. Yeah. And you can know it, but you as what you truly are, which is that bliss, is that freedom. Is Ananda, which is often translated as bliss. I don't know if you're familiar, but it's from the Sanskrit Sat Chit Ananda. And yeah. I'd say be very careful with your judgment of presence, like when you are more or less present, like the ideas of what that is and what it looks like, and being kind of in the world, learning about stuff that's not spiritual, let's say. Look at the judgment. I don't mean by judgment a negative thought or belief about it, which is also that, but look at the judgment as in the interpretation of something, the assumption, for example, of being in a state of learning something intellectual as being not present, or the going into something that's not spiritual as problematic or like tricky, or because that belief, that interpretation is what will make you not present, what will be. So the interpretation that you're now into something that's more of the world of thought, listening to a YouTube video or learning something, interpretation that is less spiritual or not present, then makes it not present. Same with going into the world, the interpretation that the world is not spiritual is what makes it not spiritual. So it's actually the interpretation that then creates the thing. So if you relate to the YouTube video as you're listening to it, and you see it as what it is, which is this magical mystery of colors, shapes, and forms, and sensations, and thoughts, and aliveness, all one field of beingness, which is now taking the shape of the experience of me listening to a YouTube video. I'm describing it, but it's not about the interpretation that I'm describing. It's about that being the actual experience. Then you'll be in a YouTube video in presence, because it will be sacred, because you are there, and all of that is sacred. And if you go into something of the world, and you see you're not going anywhere. You're not going into the world. There is no world. There's only this experience of mysterious, magical creation that is this moment. Then the in the world is just as sacred as anything. It does happen. It is, there's different levels. So when we begin this process, it is important to have foundations of practice, of observing the breath and looking at thought and and vipassana. All these kinds of practices are very important, because otherwise we won't even have the chance of noticing when we are completely immersed in thought. But at some point, there's a different kind of approach needed, where we can go into the experience of being in the world of thought, and it no longer being the thing that I need to kind of see and push away from. Where everything that is the world or the thinking space can also start to be seen as Buddha nature, let's say, Christ nature. But it can't be interpreted like that too soon, because until we know the taste of what it is that is beingness or Buddha nature. But at no point, even when we are lost in identification, is anything not Buddha nature. The only difference is, you could say somebody who is a Buddha is that whom recognizes that everything is Buddha nature all the time, no matter what. Versus one who interprets Buddha nature to be elsewhere, not here, somewhere else, coming and going, in the temple, in the teacher, in the moment of deep experience of spiritual glimpsing. And then at every other moment, Buddha nature is not here. It's not this. Mm-hmm. And then not just around you, within you, everything that you are knowing right now, all of this mystery of perception, sensation, the skin, the air, thoughts, imagination, memory, past, future, all of it. It's all this celebration of this mystery. And then we forget that, but it doesn't go away. We just forget it and we misinterpret it. And then we remember again, oh no, it is this celebration. At first it seems like that is coming and going, and we lose it and we find it. But then we realize we're just misinterpreting and then seeing clearly.